What's up, folks? Casual Dad here to cover our brand new Warhammer Combat Cards season and talk about the Votann Battlepass. Woo! And also go ahead and talk a little bit about the balance patch changes, and there are quite a few, so bear with me here. We're going to dive right into it. On the graphic right at the top here, you can see what's included in the Battle Pass. You've got the two legendaries, one of them fairly new, and then one of them has been around for a minute, as far as all of Votann has. But they're both pretty good legendaries, and then you can see these epics are emphasized as well. So it's the orange boys kin. I don't remember what the subclasses of Votann are called, which I should. And then here is the graphics across the top, and then this is the portrait card back. Yeah, so it's a decent battle pass. It focuses more heavily on epics than usual, so you get a lot of epic cards and a whole lot of copies of them as well. You don't get quite as many legendaries as we're maybe used to, but Votann don't have that many legendaries, and they do have a lot of epics. So this one feels like a relatively low card cost, but these are great utility pieces because they're low point cards. So you may benefit from this more than some of the flashier battle passes. So I'm pretty excited about this one. But let's get to the balance changes. Equally tight, focusing on the Votann and the kin. Focus on these. So this really highlights something I've talked about several times recently, that there's a big option where you basically choose between ranged and melee, especially with Votann that have basically no psychers. They have two, so you can't build a deck out of it. And right here, ranged decks are by far the most popular and highest performing, and that's just in general. That's particularly true of Votann, but that's true of the game itself. The best decks are basically all ranged, with a couple kind of high-profile outliers, but the majority of decks and Warlords will do better in a ranged deck unless they have a melee-specific ability, which most don't. So that's where we are. So I appreciate them highlighting that. It's good to see that. And yeah, so a lot of the changes, especially for Votann, are focused on melee. And this is challenging to balance, right? Because one of the biggest reasons that ranged is just better than melee is because of Barrage. Barrage is such a powerful ability on shields, regen, Akaran, any of these things where you want to hit targets adjacent to your main target. It's really, really powerful, and there isn't a melee equivalent that you get aside from Deathblow, which requires that you lose a card, and you don't have as much control of that as you do over Barrage. So I do appreciate this, and you can kind of offset the difference between melee and ranged with stats, but that's tricky because you don't want to overbuff it, or then you just completely shut down ranged as well. So, but right off the bat, we've got the cheaper Votann cards, several of them. You've got +6 melee to this little punchy guy, who I believe his main trait is Fear. Love him. Such a cool kit, one I really want to use more, but hasn't really made sense since I almost exclusively play Votann with ranged. So I'm excited to see that and enjoying trying it. Let's see. So he's got Furious Charge as a secondary trait. Okay, so it's going to be a minute before I get that, but he does have primary Fear, extra melee damage and a primary Fear. He's going to stick around on the board for a while. So yeah, excited to see that. It's also cheap. This guy also was cheap, but not quite cheap enough apparently. So he's now competing more aggressively at the lower cost card. So the Hearthkin Warriors, your basic infantry. He's getting a cost shaved down by 1, which is small but meaningful, especially with the limited card pool Votann has. Every single card that changes cost +or -1 really does change what you're able to build with the faction, especially if you have a limited collection and don't have all the cards. Next up, we got another melee buff. That is a big buff to this guy because that's his base bonus, and his levels upgrade his melee pretty aggressively. So that's pretty good. So definitely going to see him more. And then these shield guys, they've got several shielded cards. I believe he has Furious Charge, like the beefy armored ones, the Hearthkin, Hessers, Einer Champion. I don't know. I don't know the tabletop names for these too much, so I won't focus on that too much. But these are some of the kind of mid-range 20-ish point hitters that are your melee brawlers that come up in a lot of melee decks. Have always fallen a little bit short, but these changes should help quite a bit. So that +9 melee is a big bump for the shield guy over here. And then for the Furious Charge guy, the bonus to wounds is good to help him stick more, and then he also got a buff to melee. So these are pretty significant buffs so far to a small handful of cards that were particularly underperforming. And then with the Battle Pass adding this guy, who's a melee powerhouse, that really does kind of help, and the extra copies to these guys here, the first 3 of which are also fairly melee focused as well. So that's good to see. I'm going to jump to the other factions. Eldar. I love this part. It is, where's the line? Yeah, there it is. Pointy Birds. A meaningful buff to both their wounds and melee stat should help the Pointy Birds out. So that is good. It's a 3-point card, so it is very challenging to balance, like they say, but that's good. Again, that's base, so as you level it up, that is going to be compounded by a percentage, which is small because they're small numbers, but still, It will be noticeable a bit, and we may see them bumped up again. Shadow Guide, I love this. The -2 cost is huge for this card, because this is a card I always reach for and then take out when I'm balancing points, just because it was always a little bit too expensive to justify taking base versus the other cards you could take in that slot, or the other combination of cards you could take for the extra points. So that's really good. Also, the +10 to range adds a lot more cannon to that glass, so that's good. Glass cannon. So this is great. So still has a melee attack, but doesn't gain anything on that. So definitely going to be focus and range. Not a card you ever want to do melee with anyway. But yeah, appear, deal damage, and then get removed in turn. So that's always kind of been her role, that she would be played and then die. So it makes sense to have her be cheaper for that, of course. This is a big one. The Sorrow of Amun-Roth is probably the best barrage card that, second to Mogan Ra, the best like powerhouse barrage card available to Eldari, and losing that is an interesting touch, but it does kind of focus the faction a little bit more towards not leaning on barrage. So this is an interesting one. So we're going to see some of the, like the Harlequin flyer with the gun is going to be seen more as your kind of barrage flyer. I'm curious to check the stats on this. It's got a really high base attack value, so precision shot should be very powerful with this one, and that's a great one to consider in your Lilith Hesperax decks. Hesperax decks, hard to say. Anyway. Now we got Necrons, Manifest Nightmare. So they said here, right, that they thought that the ability was probably going to be a little bit too powerful, and it is extremely strong. I've always said the biggest thing that holds Manifest Nightmare back is it's an epic Warlord, which makes it extremely rare to get drops for and very slow to level up. So one of the reasons it's not dominating the ladder is just because players don't really have it. And usually they have another Necron Warlord that's more their favorite. Because the defensive ability, while extremely powerful, just isn't quite as satisfying as an offensive one. But yeah, this is a big, big bump to melee, to both attack types. And again, being that base stat, the percentage increase is really going to help the Manifest Nightmare perform aggressively again. I'm tempted to play Necrons this season just to try that out, because mine's decently leveled at this point. So, and again, does have the main stat of Fear, which makes it very, very durable. So with Fear and its base ability, Fear helps offset the base ability of not taking damage only matters against Psychic, because that's the only attack type it doesn't have. That also is one of the things that actually holds back Manifest Nightmare, is the ability almost never triggers on itself because it has both ranged and melee. So any ranged or melee attack ignores the damage reduction. So it does get the psychic defense, but yeah, still a really, really strong Warlord. I think personally probably the best of the Necron Warlords. I think, yeah. Also one of the cheaper ones. Then we got Navgran the Eternal, always one that I like to reach for because it does have that Medicae and has a decent melee stat at a good price point. But this makes the case that being it actually is more expensive relative to other factions, which makes sense. So I believe this puts it around 17 as opposed to the 20 it used to be, which is nice. That's a definitely noticeable drop. Decent chunk of points. There we go. Tau. I like this one getting a little bit of love because this is a card that finds a way in a lot of my decks because of the price point, and I never expect it to perform well. That +8 base range is going to help a lot. Likewise, this one as well. This is a barrage drone. Also comes up in my decks a lot, just as a very cheap way to deal with Akaran and shields. Really, really likes being with both Darkstrider to get the multiple barrage shots, or also with Shazo to get the damage buff. So a really useful piece to look at. If you have two taunt drones in your deck, consider replacing one of them with this and see if that performs better. Just give it a try. Servants, this is a big change that I was kind of waiting for, and not to toot my own horn, but I basically called this when they made the big debuff to Inquisitor Greyfax, because they completely reworked her ability. That opened it back up to the point where they could actually change her points again. So they've dropped her points and stats, and a point they make here is this stats buff is actually just leveling it out. So the reduction in stats is offset by the extra bonus you get from the reduced cost. So her ability triggers at a higher level. So this actually is not technically a debuff to her base ability, but then also opens up to build bigger decks and still get a decent bonus. So I'm really happy about this. They also highlight that this does actually take her out of big game hunter range because her total cost is now under 40. So that's really cool. This is very timely because the change to Greyfax's ability basically just happened, I believe, last season. I don't remember if it was the beginning or the end, or it was somewhere in the middle. But with the change to Greyfax, she definitely lost. I don't want to say viability because I still think she was good, but she definitely lost popularity for sure. So that is cool to see that. So that's a good one. This card just, I mean, I have it. I got some copies of it in a reward. It just never makes sense because it does the same things that a lot of other cards do. Going down 5 points is going to be big for competing for the point slot. It does have shields and inspiring presence, and it, like they say, good stats. And having shields and the bulk of wounds it had was pretty significant, but never had the offensive output of some of the other cards in the same points range. So that is really nice and a big, big drop. Yeah, yeah. Like I said, while it does its job of being an incredibly hard card to remove that can safely buff friendly cards while securing a lane, hard to allow deck space required for that role, especially because the Endless Celestine does the same role better, who ends up being the one I use more instead of this. So this will help it compete on a different price point. So I like it. Space Marines. These are all interesting changes. So Brother Nidon recently got the shields changed to Furious Charge, which totally makes sense. Um, well, it was kind of strange. Completely changed the role it served, and there were a lot of Furious Charges in the same place. So getting a flat increase to both attack stats, particularly melee, is a dramatic increase for this guy, and definitely makes it worth looking at a bit more closely, because that Furious Charge now hits real hard. So yeah, this was one too. So this, they say, always provided quite a niche tool. Well, traits are very powerful, quite situational when combined. So it's got fear and target acquired, which I always thought felt very, very strong, because a lot of the time when you drop target acquired, you put that card in front of something very scary, and so you expect your target acquired card to die. Which this guy having fear made that less likely and made him a really powerful piece. Him being only melee and not having a ranged stat, though, did make him a little bit niche. So the -2 cost is pretty good. The buff to stats, I personally think, is a little bit unnecessary, but I'm excited to try him out. I think I just got him to rank 3 fear, which is what I was waiting to really put him into decks. So gonna enjoy that one. But yeah, a precision melee deck, another case to have precision shot. Melee precision shot at a decent price point is really, really nice for Space Marines. I personally felt his traits made sense, but I'm not a developer. It's fine. Chaos. This one was a shock. I still consider Neems incredibly powerful in Chaos decks. He's one of the ones I see most often and one of the ones that can challenge my decks the most. But apparently he had been debuffed at some point, maybe before I was really watching. But yeah, debuffed pretty aggressively, and now he's getting some of that back, which is awesome, because the game has kind of creeped up a bit so that his previous power level kind of fits in. So he's getting wound a little bit back from that. So this is pretty cool. +10 base psychic is going to make his psionic blast really, really nasty, and the +20 base wounds is going to make him stick quite a bit more. So he's a dramatically more powerful card, certainly worth taking a look at. Saurian Loke is another interesting one. He was changed from Brotherhood of Psychers, or the Brotherhood of Psychers, I forget what it's called, where he got bonus psychic damage based on the number of other Psychers on the board, to getting anti-infantry, which was an interesting change and still kind of made sense for his points. One thing I liked about that is that makes him more of an independent operator, right? Where he does get an attack stat against certain enemy types, regardless of what other cards you have on the board with him, which is nice, because the downside of having those Brotherhood of Psychers cards is that you have to carry them with other Psychers or their ability is blank. So him losing that was actually kind of good for me. But getting the additional cost reduction and an additional dramatic increase in attack types, especially +15 base psychic, is really good. Yeah, that is dramatic. Definitely take another look at this guy. That is actually, I think, the highest single attack stat increase we see in this entire update. So that's a good one. Now, Lucius, they make some really good points about Lucius, and then the peak at Karn, you can see him on the bottom there. We'll talk about him in a second. So they changed his upgrades, so from wounds to melee. So he lost a significant amount of wounds, but gained a dramatic amount of melee, and they offset that by giving him much higher base wounds and then a higher base melee as well. So you've got both a base melee stat increase, and then 2 levels became melee stat increases, percentage increases. So that's going to make him hit way harder. And his traits didn't change. So he still has Furious Charge, Endless Furious Charge. So if you have him at level 9, if his first copy is killed, the second copy will immediately attack, making him absolutely terrific in Skulltaker decks, where you could trigger Skulltaker's ability on 2 different targets with that. So I love this. This is really good, because I always wanted to take him because the Endless is good. His melee was decent at the point I got him to, and I got him to level 9, whereas Furious Charge, which was really good. But this is going to make him a much more competitive piece, not just one I want to run, but one that I'm like, I really should run that. Counterpoint. Now we're going to be going to His wounds overall up by 20. So that actually, oh, overall. Okay, so the way this works out is the wounds upgrades were replaced, but the change to base wounds gives him a plus 20 overall increase to wounds over the entire thing. So he actually did not get less durable, he just got more melee damage. A lot more melee damage, which is great. And they talk about him living up to his reputation in lore and on the tabletop, which I really appreciate too. There's no ability right now that would do that, because the whole thing is if anyone kills Lucius, he then possesses and they become Lucius. So it's a really terrifying thing in the lore. I don't know how they would do that in game, except like going way back to old school Magic. There's a card called Tackle Maggot, where every time it kills something, the opposing player takes control of it and sticks it on one of your creatures, and it just goes back and forth. So that could have happened here, but no, this is easier to work with. Karn the Betrayer. There we go. This is a strange one. So instead of Berserk, he's got Furious Charge. So I believe Furious Charge was his secondary trait. It is now his primary trait. And then his secondary trait is now Death Blow. And then plus 10 range. So his base melee damage is still very good, but he doesn't have Berserk. And now he's got a much higher ranged attack because his range is no longer being boosted by Berserk. So I like this because one thing that was always a problem with Karn is that he does a lot of base damage, but his hit points are relatively low. So it took too long to build up the Berserk, and then he was taking too much damage in the process to really feel impactful, as Karn should. So this is a nice change where he's going to hit harder on the board faster, with that Furious Charge being the primary trait. And then that Death Blow will make his ending more impactful as well. So he's now a much more powerful piece, but also totally different. This is probably the most dramatic complete rework we see in this whole list because it is a reversal of traits. So reversal of and then removal of a trait. So this is a big one. I'm excited to try that. I like that. Orcs, these are two that have just not made sense just because they don't stat-wise compete with other cards at the price point, and they say that here. Def Grippa having Inspiring Presence, now having a higher base melee is really going to help, and then plus 2 range is interesting. And again, those are both buffed by his levels and then also his Inspiring Presence. So that is a big buff there. Yeah. And then Bubble Chucka went down 2 points. I don't love that because that card still comes up often enough to be obnoxious. And has a decent amount of hit points for the cost already. So that is dramatic. Ooh, now we get to the changes that I'm most excited about in this entire list. We got our bugs, the Tyranids. Number 1, the Neuroloid. What a name. What a name. Plus 3 melee. So they upped the base melee stat of a 3-point card. So previously it had no melee attack or no attacks whatsoever, and now it has a melee attack. That will level up with it, but it's never going to be terribly meaningful. Can actually hit in a Gosar deck, which they highlight, or can trigger a Parasite Infest on a 3-point card. So that's really, really good. Still has that outflank and the Psychic buff on both ranged and Psychic. Yeah, great for a 2-point card. I really appreciate that. It is nice that it has some kind of attack as opposed to absolutely zero. Yeah, that's nice. This is the big one, though. Death Leaper. Death Leaper's trait was changed from Outflank to Fear. This is something I talked about a lot in all of my kind of Tyranid faction reviews, my Warlord guides. The biggest thing that Tyranids struggle with really is over the course of the game, their durability falls short of most other factions by a good clip. Death Leaper already has a bunch of damage, has that Furious Charge still, because this is just its secondary trait, not its primary trait. Let's see, actually. Yeah, so right here, Fear and Shields particularly are lacking from the roster, which are the two things that add durability. Now, it doesn't make sense for Tyranids to get a lot of shields, because lore, they don't have all that many shields. The handful they have do make a lot of sense, just as they're psychic shields, whatever. But this one getting shields wouldn't make sense, but Fear is going to make it gain a lot of durability. And the reason I'm really excited about this, right, is it would drop on the table, outflank Furious Charge, really powerful on the board, and then it already had a decent amount of hit points and really high melee damage to stick around, right? But it's not a card you would ever include in your deck for durability. And at the price point it is, it always was costing your deck overall toughness and hit points to include the Death Leaper. I usually did because you wanted to go offense instead of defense, but now having that same offense and having this giant boost to defense is phenomenal. And also we just saw there's another melee and then a melee ready Fear card, and then also a Psionic Blast Fear card. Those two in combination with this now give us a very sturdy Tyranid baseline that can actually hold up the board way better than they've been able to do before. It's going to take me a while to level up those other two because they're both epic. But the Death Leaper, I have quite a high level one already, so I'm going to feel this change immediately, and I am super pumped. Yeah, this is exactly. If there was one change Tyranids needed, I don't know that I would have thought of this one, but it certainly is probably the best change they could have made in my personal book. So I love that. Especially with the reference at the top that melee is usually falling behind ranged. Tyranids are very much a melee faction, and that their melee decks have always fallen a little bit behind is a shame, and this will help a lot. So will this. The Hive Tyrant with Inspiring Presence and Berserk goes down 2 points and then has a big buff to both Psychic and Melee. Played a couple games with this today. I felt that Psychic increase dramatically because it's plus 10 base, which also increases with levels and then also increases with its Inspiring Presence. It hits for, I think, the range of 70 base, give or take, depending on level, of course, and that's high. Used to be closer to like 20. Yeah, no, I mean, I leveled it up recently, but still, that is dramatically higher, and it actually holds its own compared to the other Tyranid Psychers, which it didn't before. And at the price point, that didn't make sense. So probably saw that. Sorry about that. But yes, this is really good, and I actually checked this, and you can include this guy in more all Psyker decks and more stuff there. I actually toyed around with putting this and all the other Tyranid Psychers that would fit in a Zemont deck just to try it. And she's the cheapest Warlord in Tyranid's faction, so that fit very nicely. So just saying. And this is also a big one too. I wanted to go ahead and highlight this. These are the new cards available in your pack rotations. We're getting quest rewards, pack resort rewards. These are the copies you'll start to get. So the Taunt Devilfish, I want to say it's ranged ready, but a very high ranged attack on the Burning Chariot. This guy is a thing. These Corn cards are great, but you just really are not going to get them because they haven't been in card rotation. Now they are. These are really good for Skull Taker decks. So having just a couple copy these are very, very good. This guy I didn't realize wasn't in card packs, so he is now. This one too, Vashtor, I got in a reward pack the other day. Really stoked about it. I think that was a campaign pack, so I don't think that was in the general rotation, but still. Azrael is one I've been wanting really badly to level up for a long time, and you really do only aggressively level up the cards that are in your pack rotation, so they're in the majority of rewards. So that is great. Very excited about that. Of course, these guys here, these new cards, this is one of the newer cards. Those of you, if you're like me and don't have a copy of Commander Dante, I'm very excited at the chance to get him. I did just get this guy in a card shop the other day, which, hey, the card shop has suddenly started offering cards that you don't own in your collection yet, which is awesome. I will pay 100 gold for a copy of a card I don't have. That is just real good. So that is the end of our discussion of the balance changes. I'm not going to go too much into detail about the Battle Pass itself. Just to note again, the cosmetics. Yeah. So the cosmetics rewards cards in it. These cards should all be familiar. This is what's included in the Battle Pass. It's a great Battle Pass. If you want to play Votann, really cool. And I really like the aesthetic of this stuff here. Note that it is that specific orange clan. So that may be a promise that we have more of that coming in the future. So that's cool. Yeah, that's it. Until next time, happy gaming.